Okay, so we've got a pretty hefty file on JD Vance for this deep dive.
Me too.
Articles, notes.
Campaign finance reports?
Yeah, campaign finance reports even.
Yeah.
And he's got a lot of titles these days, right? Senator, author, venture capitalist.
Right.
And now some are even saying he might run for president in 2028.
It's been floated.
Yeah, it's out there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even begin with a guy like this? What makes him tick?
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing about JD Vance is that he's taken such an unconventional path to sort of becoming this political figure.
Right.
You don't often see somebody go from writing a best-selling memoir about Appalachian poverty to rubbing shoulders with Silicon Valley billionaires and then ending up in the Senate.
Yeah, and that's actually a great place to start, I think, his book, right? Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the book that kind of launched him into the national spotlight.
It did.
And it gives us this really intimate look at his childhood, right?
Right.
Middletown, Ohio.
Yeah.
The struggles of his family, his community.
Opioid crisis.
The opioid crisis hitting really hard.
Of course.
And then there's his own journey, right? From that environment to the Marines, to Yale Law School, and then finally Silicon Valley.
You can't talk about Vance without talking about that contrast between those two worlds, right?
You're right.
Going from this working class background to these really elite institutions to the world of high finance.
Absolutely. And I do want to acknowledge, though, that the book has also received its fair share of criticism.
Oh, sure.
Some have argued that it oversimplifies the very real complexities of poverty.
Right.
That it puts too much emphasis on personal responsibility and like getting out as the be-all end-all solution.
Right. And some people would say that the book is more nuanced than that.
Right.
But I think it's a fair criticism to make.
It's something to consider, for sure. And it's interesting, though, because you look back at some of his writing and, for example, for the Frum Forum, you actually see like a more nuanced approach to policy.
Right.
He even at some points questioned traditional conservative stances on things like budget cuts.
Right.
But this is where things get even more interesting, because this is a guy who was a vocal never-Trumper.
Right.
He openly criticized Trump's character.
Yep.
He called him dangerous. He even likened him to, quote, another opioid, end quote.
Oh.
And it wasn't just, offhand comments. He went after Trump's policies as well.
Right.
He called them immoral to absurd.
Wow.
And just to really hammer home this point, he collaborated with David Frum, another very prominent never-Trumper. Right. And yet he ends up not only endorsing Trump, but also getting Trump's endorsement for his Senate race.
That's a hell of a turnaround.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we make sense of that?
Well, I think you can see him grappling with these ideas in some of his earlier writing.
Okay.
Particularly in a piece he wrote for the American Conservative, where he kind of calls out both Democrats and Republicans.
Okay.
For failing to really address the concerns of the right working class.
All right, so we've established a bit of a backstory here.
Right.
But we need to talk about the AEI years now.
Yeah.
Because this is where he spends some time at the American Enterprise Institute.
Right, a conservative think tank.
Exactly. And this is the same institution where Yuval Levin worked.
Yes.
And it's important to note that Levin has publicly criticized Trump's election fraud claims and even called the entire January 6th attack a narcissistic psychodrama.
Yeah, and it was actually Levin who brought Vance onto AEI as a visiting scholar.
Wow.
So again, you see this tension between Vance's association with individuals who have been openly critical of Trump,
right,
and then his eventual embrace of Trump and Trumpism.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because we start to see these accusations of big tech hypocrisy.
Well, how so?
Well, you've got Vance, on the one hand, railing against big tech censorship.
Yeah.
Arguing that conservatives should break ties with corporations who are censoring conservative voices online.
Right.
But at the same time, he's receiving a paycheck from a firm that's funded by tech executives.
Oh.
And not just any tech executives, but some from Facebook and Google.
I see, yeah.
So it's like this classic example of the kind of revolving door that we see so often between politics, business, and activism.
Right, for sure.
And it leaves you wondering, is this a calculated move, or is it just a matter of evolving viewpoints?
Yeah.
And how do we square that circle?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's one that we're going to have to keep coming back to as we sort of unpack more of his policy positions. So why don't we start with an area where you might be surprised to learn where Vance stands?
Okay.
And that is unions.
Okay.
Now, you would think that a conservative like Vance would be all about right-to-work laws and really limiting union power.
Right. I mean, that seems to be kind of like the conservative playbook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Vance actually breaks with that assumption.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he's come out against right-to-work laws, and he even signed on to this report that advocated for all these reforms that would strengthen unions.
Wow, so he's actually pro-union.
He seems to be pushing for this more worker-centric approach, which is a real departure, I think, from the traditional Republican stance on these issues.
It is interesting, and it makes you think about his stance on healthcare, which you've given me a lot of information on this, and it seems very complicated.
It's, yeah, I mean, he's criticized Obamacare.
Right.
But he's also condemned the Republican replacement bill, calling it a moral and political disaster.
Right.
And he even said that millions of people would lose health care under that plan.
So it's not like a clear-cut he's pro or anti-government healthcare. It's like he's trying to find some sort of, I don't know.
Yeah, he's trying to balance conservative principles with the realities of people's lives on the ground.
Absolutely. And you see that same tension in his stance on trade, too.
Yeah.
He's really moved away from this idea of pure free trade as like a solution.
Not a magic solution.
Yeah. And he's even said that he doesn't necessarily think that trade deals are the only thing that are responsible for job losses.
Right.
And I think this is interesting given that quote that we have from him where he says you can't just flip the trade switch and bring back all the steel jobs to Middletown.
Right.
I mean, it does seem like he understands the complexities of globalization and what it's doing.
He gets it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on because I want to make sure we have time to talk about social safety nets because this is where it seems like it gets really paradoxical.
It does, yeah. And it's really interesting. You know, early on in his career, Vance seemed very much in favor of cutting social programs.
Right, like deep cuts to Social Security and Medicare.
All in the name of fiscal sanity.
Right, right.
But then he comes out in opposition to Biden's child care assistance plan.
And he's criticized student loan forgiveness.
Right.
But then years ago, he supported Hillary Clinton's free college plan.
Yeah, so how do you make sense of that?
It feels like he's trying to appease his base, who are fiscally conservative.
Right.
But at the same time, he's acknowledging that there are very real anxieties about the economy.
It's a tough needle to thread.
Yeah, and it seems like he's always walking this tightrope.
He is.
And we don't know which way he's going to fall.
We don't. He's full of surprises.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of tough topics, I think it's time that we move on to the next part of what you've given us, which is culture wars and controversies, because this is where things get really interesting. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on JD Vance's economic policies, but you've also given us a lot to unpack on where he stands on social issues.
Yeah, and this is where I think things get even more, well, some might say controversial, right?
Yeah.
When you look at his stance on things like abortion, immigration,
Yep.
race, these are the hot button issues that really get people fired up.
Absolutely, and they dominate the headlines.
They do. Yeah.
So let's dive right in.
Yeah.
Abortion, I mean, it's no secret that Vance is pro-life.
Right.
But it seems like he's gone even further than that.
Yeah, he has. I mean, he's on record saying that he would support banning abortion even in cases of rape and incest.
Wow.
Calling those situations inconvenient.
Wow. And you can imagine how those statements have gone over.
Yeah, not well. And he's also received a lot of criticism for comments that he's made about, suggesting that women should stay in violent marriages for the sake of their children.
Right. And so it's clear that he has a very specific view on family values.
Yep.
But I mean, those comments have really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Right, for sure.
I mean, do they not call it the culture war for a reason?
Yeah.
And then you add on top of that his stance on immigration, which also seems to be a little bit, well...
It's complicated.
It's complicated, yeah.
Yeah, because early on, remember, Vance was actually critical of Trump's Muslim ban.
Right.
But then later on, he comes out in support of Texas's efforts to secure its border.
So he goes from opposing a ban that targets a specific religion to supporting border security measures that some people say target a specific ethnicity.
Right. And this all kind of tied into his views on race, too.
Right.
And this idea of the ruling class that he talks about.
Yeah.
He says that, elites are using racial tensions surrounding immigration to manipulate black voters against their own economic interests.
So he's tying all these things together.
He is.
Okay, well, let's move away from social issues for a second and talk about money, because you've given us this breakdown of his campaign contributions,
right,
top piece corporations, individual donors.
Sure.
And it's a lot. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty diverse group, as you might expect for any politician.
Right.
There are contributions from a range of industries represented there.
Okay.
But I do think that some of the connections are worth a closer look.
Okay. Like what?
Well, for example, there are some pretty sizable contributions coming from groups that have ties to big tech.
Oh, interesting.
Which is interesting considering, some of his past critiques of those companies.
Right.
So it does make you wonder a little bit about the nature of those relationships and whether or not maybe they've evolved over time.
Okay, so as we kind of start to wrap up our deep dive here, I have to say, we've covered a lot.
We have.
From his childhood in Middletown to Silicon Valley, and now he's a U.S. Senator.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. So where does he stand? I mean, we've seen what seem like contradictory positions on things like foreign policy.
Yeah.
Early on, he's criticizing interventionism, military misadventures, as he called them.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, he's a staunch supporter of Ukraine aid.
Yeah, and not just that, but he justified that support by saying that it would help prevent a future impeachment of Trump.
Wow, so he's tying foreign policy to domestic political calculations.
He is, which, I mean, it's a bold move. And it really speaks to the fact that this is somebody who understands how power works.
Yeah, and what about his nonprofit, our Ohio Renewal? This was supposed to be an organization that helps disadvantaged youth, but then you look at the spending records.
Right. And it does raise some questions.
It does.
Because, a lot of the funds went to things like staff salaries and overhead, but very little actually went towards programs that would directly benefit the kids.
So did it really live up to what it was supposed to do?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and I think that's the question that we're left with about JD Vance in general.
Yeah.
Is this a guy who's really out there fighting for the working class? Or is he just a really good politician?
Right.
Is he driven by his convictions? Or is he just kind of changing as he goes along?
Yeah, is this somebody with deeply held beliefs? Or is this somebody who's just kind of, riding the wave of whatever is politically expedient at the moment?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what makes him so interesting to me.
It does, because he's tapped into something.
He has.
There's a real sense of frustration, of anxiety, of people who just feel like they've been left behind.
Right.
And he's speaking to that.
Absolutely.
But can he actually channel that into something meaningful?
I don't know.
Or is he just going to ride that wave to get where he wants to go?
That's the question.
It is the question.
Right
It's
there.
rarely simple, is it? American politics.
No, it's messy.
Yeah, messy. And I think, JD Vance is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, you can't put him in a box.
You can't. And that makes him fascinating.
It does.
And maybe a little bit terrifying.
Maybe.
Well, on that note,
I think we've left our listeners with plenty to think about.
I think so too. And hopefully all the information they need to make up their own minds.
Exactly. The rest is up to them.
Well said. And with that, we'll be back next week with another deep dive.